Okay, everybody is joining us. So we'll just wait a couple seconds just to make sure we have everybody in. Okay. Okay, we're going to begin. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar, Queens of Ancient Nimrud, with Dr. Amy Gansell and Dr. Helen Malko. We are absolutely thrilled about the large attendance, and we hope you enjoy this webinar. I'm Alexandra, your host and moderator of the event. I am the Executive Director at Assyrian Studies Association, a nonprofit with a mission to promote the academic study of the Assyrian heritage through supporting research, teaching, and intellectual collaboration among scholars from various fields from around the globe. Before we begin this presentation, I want to touch on some house rules. As an attendee, your microphone and video will be muted and turned off throughout the presentation. All questions will be entertained after the presentation. Please refer to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to type in your questions. Given that we have about 122 attendees right now, we will try to answer questions you may have. If you are viewing this on Facebook Live, please note that we will try our best to answer questions in the comment section as well. And now I'd like to take this time to introduce our panelists. Our first is Dr. Amy Gansell. She's an associate professor of art history and the coordinator of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at St. John's University in Queens, New York. She holds an MA and a PhD in the history of art from Harvard University. From 2008 to 2010, she worked for the US Department of State as an associate coordinator for Iraqi and Afghan cultural heritage. Dr. Gansell has received numerous grants and fellowships, including one from the Academic Research Institute in Iraq and two from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her scholarly essays have appeared in prestigious international journals, including the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, Journal of Archaeological Science, and the American Journal of Archaeology. She has also co-edited two books, Cyber Research on the Ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, and Testing the Canon of Ancient Near Eastern Art and Archaeology. She's currently writing a book on ancient Assyrian queens. Our second panelist, Dr. Helen Malko, is an anthropological archaeologist with training in cultural heritage preservation and practices. She is currently a board of director at Assyrian Studies Association and the associate director at the American Center of Research in Amman, Jordan. Her research focuses on archaeology of the Near East, as well as the destruction of monuments and historical landscapes in Iraq and its impact on the local communities, including the Assyrians. Dr. Malko received her master's degree from Baghdad University and a PhD from Stony Brook University. Her recent publications include Heritage Wars, a Cultural Genocide in Iraq, and the Kassites of Babylonia, a re-examination of an ethnic identity. Dr. Gansell and Dr. Malko, good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today for this special webinar on Assyrian queens.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Alexandra. Hello, Amy. It's a great pleasure to be here today to have this conversation with a dear colleague. So I will join Alexandra to thank you very much, Amy, for taking the time and being with us, and welcome to the Assyrian Studies Association webinar series. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much. And for me also, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to be doing something with Assyrian Studies Association. I am so happy to be in conversation with Helen, and I'm so happy for the attendance because what we're going to be talking about is a topic about which I'm really passionate, near and dear to my heart, and I love to share it with people. So I'm so glad you've all come to join us.
Yes, indeed. Same here. I think we are very excited, and I know that we have very rich and exciting discussion ahead of us. We are going to speak about the queens, cover different aspects of their lives, and how they were found, and their jewelries and remains, and so on. But I was thinking that maybe before we dive into that discussion, I was thinking, Amy, maybe it's useful for all of us to kind of set the stage and start with like questions such as like where Nimrud is and why it's important, and what is the Northwest Palace. We talk about Northwest Palace where the queens were found, and also how did we know about Nimrud and about the remains of the queen. So just like, let's set up ourselves and take it from there and then move to the queens.
Sure, absolutely. So Nimrud is an archaeological site. It is not a modern city. There is a modern village about 3 kilometers away from it. It is situated in Iraq. It's about 30 kilometers, 20 miles southeast of where Mosul is today. And it is important because it has had so much research and excavation that's been done. It's an important site to us because we have a lot of knowledge about it. It first became, it was known, it's mentioned in the Bible. You may be familiar in Genesis of the story of the great hunter Nimrod, who founds a city. So this is already kind of an establishment of Nimrud very early on in histories that have survived. And then it's also mentioned in Micah as the land of the Assyrians. So with that knowledge from the Bible in the 1800s, archaeologists and explorers were looking to find some of these sites that were mentioned. And Nimrud was one that was discovered quite early on in the 1840s. So it was excavated from the 1840s up to 1879. And then there was a bit of a hiatus, and it was excavated again, starting about 100 years later in 1949, on and off by various international teams, including Iraqi teams that made the most significant discoveries up until the early 90s. And continued research has been continuing to go on there at the site. So it is a window. It's important because it is a window for us as modern people onto ancient history. We have the remains, things that have been found at Nimrud. We have architecture. We have the structure of a city. So we have urban planning. We have artifacts. We have cuneiform tablets. We have artworks, and we even have human remains that have allowed us to kind of understand the biology and the way people were living and dying and being buried at this site. So I can actually briefly, I'm going to share my screen. I brought some slides I'll just be showing you on and off to give you an idea of, can you see my screen?
Not yet, Amy.
Not yet. Okay, so let me just get the share. Here we go.
Yes, now we can see.
Okay, great. So just to orient everybody, I have here, and if the little boxes with our faces are in the way, you can minimize it or move it out of the way. So Assyria, we're talking about, it's in what is northern Iraq today. Nimrud, I have underlined here. You can see its relationship to Mosul, orient you in relation to Baghdad, or is another famous city you might have heard of, which is in the south of Iraq today. And Nimrud used to be on the Tigris River as a royal city. Of course, it was on the river. The course of the river has changed. So the Tigris now goes through Mosul. And I have these pictures of the Tigris at Mosul in modern times to give you an idea of a vibrant, living city on the river. That is the city, although the architecture would have been different, but that is the kind of living city I want you to imagine when we're talking about ancient Nimrud. Ancient Nimrud has been reconstructed, in particular the Northwest Palace that you're going to be talking about, through 3D technology. So you have an example here of the citadel covered, it was raised up, walled off. You have the palace here with a second wall around the palace. And that was right up against the Tigris River. So that should give you a sense of it. The scale of this palace is extraordinary. Some of those courtyards you see are larger than football fields. So the whole palace itself is about the size of a very large American shopping mall. So you can kind of have the sense, if you've ever parked at a shopping mall and you know you walk from one end to the other, you feel like you've walked miles that day. This is just a closer up view of that 3D reconstruction of the palace. So you can get a sense of how people would be moving through the spaces here. And of course, underneath the palace, what we're going to be focusing on as our kind of entry point into looking at the queens are the tombs where they were buried. So this is just a floor plan showing you tombs kind of scattered throughout what were the domestic quarters of the palace. And these were found in the late 1980s to the early 1990s by Iraqi excavations directed by Muzahim Hussein from the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. And this is just an example of the architecture of those tombs. When I say the women were buried under the floors, they didn't dig a hole in the floor. They had elaborate vaulted architectural structures like you see here with stone sarcophagi in them, in which the bodies were laid and surrounded by wealth. There are also some metal coffins like you see here. So this, I hope, just gives you a sense of where we are with that palace. Did I hit on everything that you asked there?
Yes, indeed. Amazing presentation. I really liked that how you linked to Mosul and what a thriving city on Tigris would look like. That's really a good way of bringing the ancient city to life. And I should agree, actually, I was privileged that I was able to visit the site. And Nimrud used to be, before it was destroyed, it used to be like an open air museum. So you would walk through the buildings and the palace that Amy just showed, and you would experience the space that the ancients have experienced, you know, so the ancient people, ancient Assyrians have moved in this space, and you can experience that. And you could move, you could walk on like ancient floors with ancient tiles. So it was fascinating. It's indeed a very, very important archaeological site, and also a city that we learn from a lot. But Amy, I know, obviously, I mean, everyone is fascinated by Nimrud and the queens, but how did you become interested in the queens? I know your PhD dissertations was was on a different topic, right? But then this came in. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the story of how I came to this topic because it's almost like an archaeology dig itself. It just goes through kind of layers of my experience and layers of my research, how I was eventually led to these tombs. So the first thing I should say, when I was thinking, you know, very early on in grad school of dissertation topics, the one thing I thought I didn't want to do was Assyria, because I felt like there was so much research that had already been done on it. And most of what I had been exposed to were also stories that didn't really interest me, stories of the military exploits and the histories of the kings. And it seemed like really a pretty established body of scholarship. And I wanted to do something different. So I decided, well, I'm interested in women in history. So I'm going to find a topic on women. And then I thought, well, what was beauty and what was ideal feminine beauty? So I started looking for material that I could research as an art historian that would lead me to those answers. What was feminine beauty in ancient Mesopotamia? So I will show you, I'll take you on a brief trail. I'll share my screen again of how that question led me to the Assyrian tombs at Nimrud. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. All right, so in order to study the ideal beauty represented in art, I had to find a body of material or artifacts that had a lot of images of women. So one of those, and one of the most published bodies of material, were these Levantine sculptures of women. And so I show you a smattering of their heads here. There are hundreds of these. So I was able to kind of do research looking across this material. This is from the first millennium BC. So this is the time of the Assyrians, but you know, it was a different category than what I thought had been done in the study of Assyrian palaces. So I'm making my way through this, and I'll give you an idea too. These ivories were excavated many of them came from Nimrud itself. They were excavated from Assyrian sites. So they were importing these ivories into Assyrian palaces. Probably, we know they're in storage rooms. I also think they're using them in elaborate furnishings that the kings and queens and royal court were using. You see these chairs and tables here in this famous sculpture showing the king and queen at Nineveh, another Assyrian capital, and also some objects such as this little box on the table. Well, what archaeologists were finding carved in ivory were pieces of furniture like you see here on the top that could be reconstructed to build furniture. So these Levantine ivories were being brought to Assyria. They were parts of furniture, and they're also comprising, like you see here, small portable objects such as a box, such as something like you might see here on the table. So many of these ivory objects, and you can see a woman here, were decorated with images of women. So they were meant to be attractive, beautiful, decorated with beautiful images. So that brings us back to these women. And as I'm trying to figure out, they're so different. What do they have in common? Looking across them, I found a lot of consistency in their jewelry. There are different types of jewelry. And in studying the jewelry, one day, I couldn't believe it. My professor, Irene Winter, came walking down the hall toward me with this book. And she said, you might want to look at the jewelry excavated from the queen's tombs at Nimrud. I thought, why have I never heard of this before? Well, at that time, it was the early 2000s. The book had only recently been published, and it was only in Arabic. And as far as I could tell, there were only less than probably half a dozen copies of this in the United States. It wasn't something you could get in the library. It wasn't something you could purchase on Amazon. So it was the equivalent of a rare book. When I opened the pages, I almost fell over because this is what I was finding. So this is now a very kind of famous, well-known headdress, a diadem. It matches up with the styles that you saw on these ivory carvings. We have anklets, we have necklaces, I'm just kind of mousing over them, and earrings, similar to many of these types of jewelry found in those tombs at Nimrud. So this is what led me to the Nimrud tombs. So I had to finish my dissertation, which I loved, on the ivories and ideal feminine beauty, and which has really helped me come to understand what's going on with what we're finding in those tombs. But once I knew about those tombs, I said, as soon as I finish this dissertation, I have got to go and do a lot of work on that material.
And indeed you did, you did. So one thing I would like to ask you, so what was next step? So this is started as an interest, but then you adopted it, you made it in like into academic research, and also like, you know, sharing with public. So public knowledge, creating public knowledge too. So what did you do next? Where did you take this interest to?
That is the best way of describing it, Helen, because it really did. It started out, I don't want to say as a hobby, but I was so intrigued. It was like this side project I was doing. I actually, I made Xeroxes of some pages from the book, and I was cutting out the pieces of jewelry, almost like doing paper dolls, literally laying them out on my bed, trying to figure out how they would have constituted outfits, how the jewelry was worn, because the way it was published and had been presented, it wasn't really associated with the woman who wore it. These things were looked at as individual artworks and treasures. And I was really curious about how they dressed the figure. It got to a certain point, and I'm not kidding, I took my shower curtain down because I was thinking, well, how would you have some wrapped dress draped around you with this jewelry? And I was trying to wrap myself in the shower curtain. And at that point, I realized like, this is getting crazy. I need to take some time and address this methodologically as a serious research project, because there is so much to discover. And the fact that I was so excited about it, I knew other people would be too. So I'll take you through, you want to see some of the stuff and see where I went with it. I'll share my screen again. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so these are just some photos of various objects that were found in those tombs. And you see them stored in boxes. You see the gold, you see them kind of being unwrapped and explored. This is great, but what this was presenting was the objects as treasures and exciting individual items. I started thinking, how did these items add up to a queen? How did they relate to the body? But first, let's take you through what we've got. We have all the elements of head to toe dress. So heaps and heaps of earrings in various designs. Here you see many examples, different types of beads, also gold necklaces and some pendants. Anklets and bracelets always occurring in pairs and sometimes very heavy. The heaviest anklets were about 3.5 pounds each. So heavy, you could still walk with 3.5 pound weights on your ankles, but you would be very aware of the presence of that wealth on your body. And rings coming in sets of 10. So you're going to wear them on every finger of both hands in these matching sets. And of course, headdresses of a variety of types, from cap-like crowns to diadems. And there were some other very kind of thin, fine woven wires of gold that could be worn around the head as well. And these are the intact headdresses. There were also several components of this diadem type that you see here found kind of broken. They probably would have had leather or cloth attachments, and that's why we only have some of the pieces left, but lots and lots of adornment. So I started to think, of course, how is it worn on the body? So I had to go look in the publication, and I started putting the items of adornment in the coffins where the find spots were listed. But in most of the tombs, they didn't explain where the objects were found. They just listed the numbers. So I would look up, say 1989.195, go to the index, go to the illustrations and find, oh, cool, it's a mirror, and put it there. So what I started building out turned out to be head to toe dress, going down to the anklets at the bottom and the headdress at one end of the sarcophagus. Sometimes you're finding earrings or bracelets on either side of the coffin as well. So we know these women were buried wearing their adornment in addition to having heaps of it included in their coffins. In addition to that, there is evidence that they were clothed. They were not in there naked, covered in jewelry. They were wearing garments. And that's the story of my shower curtain, because this is all that survives. These little tufts of fabric and bits of fabric, it's all linen. One tested as cotton, but everything else tested as linen. There are even some tassels that survive intact, but we don't have a full garment. We don't have a full piece of cloth. So to try to figure out how the women were dressed, we have to turn to art. In addition to these bits of fabric, though, that are highly deteriorated, there were pounds, kilos of gold elements. They're very thin with either holes in them or loops on the back, like buttons that would have been sewn onto garments. And this might be some trim, these gold ribbons that would have gone along the edges of garments. So thinking about how we would dress the queen, this is a close-up image of the queen from that first sculpture that I showed you that had the king and queen dining together. If you look closely, you can see how the garment is wrapped and draped with fringes and tassels on it and decorations. So we imagine that might be gold foils like we saw coming from the tomb. I worked with, at the time I was teaching at FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology, where they had courses in draping. So I worked with the students in the advanced draping course. I was so lucky to have that opportunity to try to wrap fabric to reconstruct what the garment might have looked like. It proved to be impossible to match what we see in art. At least we did not crack the code, but this was our final outcome. It really doesn't quite match. Looking at some other garments in art, we see some examples that are simpler with just short sleeves and a sort of belted tunic. So for the reconstruction that I ultimately produced that you see here, I can show it to you larger here. We went with a very simple kind of sheath dress, adding the gold foils to it. This is just an interpretation. It's for the sake of clothing the queen. We don't know exactly how the fabric would have been layered or draped or the position of these gold decorations, but you can imagine she would have glittered. You're walking through a palace in torchlight. You're walking into one of those courtyards bathed in sunlight. You would be reflecting light covered in gold like this. And then to scale on a model, as you see here, she's modeled to be about 5'1". We produced the jewelry to scale and put it on her body. So hopefully it's a very kind of naturalistic example of how the queen would have been dressed. Now, the next step, like, what do we, I'm so excited to have a dressed queen, but now again, I just have an object. This is a human, this is history, this is living history. So what was her life like? Put the model in the palace. I believe I've identified a suite of rooms that could be her throne room. So this is just a reconstruction that is done, a computer generated reconstruction of the king's throne room. So I'm giving you a sense of it here. Imagine if we reconstructed a queen's throne room, if we brought her into the palace. There is one, I'll also put this link in the chat for you. There is one reconstruction that's on YouTube that uses the queen, the model of it. She's animated. She walks into this room where they're banqueting, and she doesn't really do anything though, because you could say we don't know what the queen was doing, but we actually do. And that's some of what I will be telling you about as well. But at least we have her animated in the palace. What I would like to see eventually is maybe through our research and in our interpretations, that the 3D model of the queen for public understanding, for educational purposes, to be shown in museums, that the queen is brought into the highest ranking context of the palace. She's shown side by side with the king. So this is just, I've just popped the model down here in a model of the king's throne room. So you can see her standing next to the queen. And hey, eventually what we want to have is just the queen in the palace as a powerful presence. So hopefully that image can linger in the back of your minds as we continue to talk about what these queens were doing, why they were important too.
Wow, Amy, that is fascinating. And I have to say, some of the pictures, like the photos of the fabric, I've never seen before. So it's amazing. We know that fabric and organic material doesn't survive in Mesopotamia, unfortunately. So even the bits and pieces are very, very highly treasured. And it's fascinating to see some of these pictures. So I really like how you touch on different things, like while you're explaining the bigger image, but I would like to focus a bit on what you said about the queen and bringing her into the palace, putting her into the palace, and also making her visible. Because as most of us know here, and me and you, we know, we talk a lot about the king and the power of the king and the reliefs and the propaganda, and the palace is always the king's palace, right? So us modern scholars, today's people, today's culture, we don't see the queen. Although I'm pretty sure that she was quite visible for her own people. So I want kind of to talk a little bit about that, and what do you think it was the situation in the past, and what we're doing by looking at these ancient cultures and the material culture, because you touched on them, on these little issues.
Yeah, no, that it's so important. And it's not our fault as modern people that we think of the palace as the king's space, because that's the evidence that we have, that we've been given, that has been interpreted, that has been taught. That's what I was taught too. And that is what's out there. I haven't published my book yet. So, you know, it's not so easily accessible, the information that we do have about the queens. But in doing research on women, we often find that we need to look in different places, sometimes in what seems to us to have been hidden places. But that doesn't mean that the queens, that women in history were hidden in their own times, like you said. So when the tombs were discovered, and there are texts, cuneiform text inscriptions in those tombs that identify these women as queen. It uses the title queen. They also refer to their thrones, queen who sits on the throne. So we have women in titled positions of power who are sitting on thrones. Well, where are those thrones? They've got to be in the palace. So these are significant women politically. And I would also say symbolically, as the partner of the king, they are doing a job that is just as important as what the king is doing. It's kind of keeping the universe in balance. One of the really important jobs that they did was their involvement in religion and keeping relationships with various very high-ranking gods and goddesses of the pantheon. The king was very closely associated with the divine, but the queen's work in that divine sphere has again kind of been overshadowed by our scholarly research focus on what the kings were doing. But the queens had great responsibility in their roles in religion, some of which were to help to protect the empire and to protect the king himself. So queens are doing a significant job there. And there are texts about something called the substitute king ritual. So when there's a bad omen, the real king is hidden off as a farmer, and two people are selected to stand in and ultimately probably be killed so that the king can be safe. Well, those two people are a substitute king and queen. So it is also the queen who was so important that had to be protected and have this substitute kind of presented. And in some of those rituals, you hear of what the substitute king and queen are doing. One of the things they do is that they're dining. So this brings to mind the idea that, you know, you're having these state dinners and state banquets. The queen may have been very well present at those. Why do we keep saying she's present? She has a throne, she's going to banquets. Look at what she's wearing. Look at what they're buried at in the tombs. I don't think that's just for the afterlife. In fact, some of the jewelry matches up to the few images we have of queens and what they're wearing, particularly as a kind of earring. So what we see in their tombs is what they look like in life. They're, I think, walking around, circulating in this palace, being seen in this glorious golden state. The only person who is similarly dressed would be the king. The other identities that are glowing in gold are the statues of gods and goddesses. So that's how highly elevated the queen would have been. We also know at queens' funerals that they were great large state events. It's unclear when they are being buried in the palace who had access to the palace in that burial, but the death of a queen was a significant point in the living history of the Assyrian royals. And it was something that would have been known broadly, not just within the palace. Once the queens were buried, also they had ceremonies at least annually for the deceased queens. Those women were not forgotten. And it wasn't just their memory that was maintained. Their spirit was thought to always be dwelling in that palace. So the palace was a place full of queens and their presence, living and dead. It was the eternal home of these queens.
It's really amazing now that you mentioned like being buried in the palace, because you tend to forget that they are actually buried in their living quarters and they are part of the whole thing. And as you said, like they're always there, like they are present and they exist. Also, this made me think of like how we think of ourselves at now modern cultures and societies, and how proud we are of, like, you know, where women are today and the role of women, and, you know, being upfront, being in different jobs, you know, being visible, trying to like, depending where are you in the world. But here is an ancient society thousands of years ago already telling us that there were women who actually were visible, were in the leading position, and they could be our role model, right? So we're not inventing something new. true, like correct?
Yes, no, that's a really, really important point. So just kind of going back to these queens' lives and their work, what they did. There's evidence that they were literate. There's evidence that young royal women were being trained to read and write. There's even a text that kind of chides a royal daughter for not doing her homework, so not being prepared to take on kind of the administrative responsibilities that she'd have to. All of these queens had seals. So a seal is just a device for making a mark equivalent to your signature. So they're authorizing things, they're signing documents, they are overseeing textile industry. We have evidence that they had industry dispersed across the empire that they were overseeing. It wasn't just something local, like a loom weaving room in the palace somewhere, but this was an enterprise. They had real estate, they had land, they oversaw factions of the military that they could probably make decisions about. I'm sending them out to help support the needs in this part of the empire. So they are really busy working women. They are also mothers. Part of the importance of their partnership with the king was the symbolic and biologic fertility of reproducing heirs. Not all heirs were born to the queen. The king did have other wives, but the queen's, one of her responsibilities was to, at least in symbol, be the other half of the male and female fertility, to reproduce heirs, but then symbolize the whole empire as a fertile site that has fertile agriculture, that has a growing population that's healthy. And going back to her role as a mother, queens were absolutely credited, especially as they got older, with being the mother of the next queen. The queen mother is a really important role, but they also had childcare, so that is okay. We know that there's discussions of nannies. There's even wet nurses that would be employed. Children may have been kind of living at various points in nearby palaces, and the ceremonial palace was probably not a place where a child was in the limelight in public, where mothering was really taking place. So these women, just like modern women today, had multifaceted lives, and they were balancing so many aspects of identity.
It's fascinating. So I want to for our discussion to stay a little bit on this, and basically the question of how we approach ancient societies and how we understand them, how we look at this material culture and interpret the material culture. We do know that in many times that we kind of impose our thinking, our impression of today and I know that you have in your recent book, you try to reevaluate how we look at ancient Mesopotamian art and art in the ancient Near East in general. And here I'm referring to your book, Testing the Canon of Ancient Near Eastern Art and Archaeology. And I think we will have a link to this book in the chat box if the audience would like to check this book, because in this book, I know that you've invited academics and non-academics to contribute with chapters on how we understand the material culture, the art, the archaeology of Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. And I know you had a lot of contributions, and the chapters are just amazing. So I would like to ask you the idea behind the book and what is the book set to do? So in this sense of our approach to ancient cultures and material culture.
Okay, great. This is a topic that queens are not discussed in that book, but part of my interest and passion for queens is an interest and passion in what has not been represented in the kind of mainstream story of ancient Mesopotamian history. And that is sometimes the most informative and most interesting aspects of the history, is what is not talked about as much. So the canon is the canon of ancient Mesopotamia. These are the things that come to mind, like the icons of the culture. You might think of Hammurabi's code, Naram-Sin, just names sites, or Nimrud. The big famous places, but the stories behind those and the context that these monuments and sites and artworks existed in get pushed to the back, pushed to the side, get lost actually in the emphasis on these main things. And first of all, and I worked with another scholar, Ann Schaefer, and we developed this idea and we co-edited a book. We realized we couldn't do it by ourselves, that we needed to have specialists of various regions of the Near East, various types of materials, such as palaces or cylinder seals, really speak to their aspects, their slices of what has become the icons of ancient Mesopotamian culture. And when they did so, we said, find out why something became so famous. How did it become so famous? And it was often for political reasons or for convenience, or just because that happened to be found at the right time and in the right place. And there was a lot of coverage of it, not because it was necessarily the most important thing representing a culture. So that's what has come down to us. We also asked, though, if this ancient culture is the heritage of living communities, how do those communities feel about how they have become represented to the world through these this canon, through this limited assortment of iconic objects? And in doing that, we also found out that the canon, it's not something, we should just get rid of this and start focusing just on the queen's jewelry or something like that, or just on those little ivory carvings. That's more important. The public face of the ancient Near East through the monuments that have become so famous is also really important, because that is how the world interfaces. It's the gateway into learning about these ancient cultures. Those are the things that are displayed in museum galleries with the spotlights on them. When somebody doesn't know about the ancient cultures, that is going to be their starting point. So we need to keep those things, I think, alive, keep them exciting, but learn to link them to the rest of the story.
Yeah, and I should point out here, and this is really important for Asa to let the audience know, that we have Assyrians contributors to your book. So you have like 2 or 3 Assyrians authors contributing and putting their own perspective and view on the how this heritage is presented as being part of their heritage, or they feel that it's their heritage. So that's really fascinating, because I think I might be wrong, but I think it's the first time that such an opportunity had presented itself, and thanks to you and Anne for putting this forward, because I think it is important to be more inclusive and be more holistic in how we approach this ancient material. So dear audience, you have the link to the book. Please check and have a look. It's really a great contribution to academia, and also just people who are interested in Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East art. Now I want us to come back to the queens, and I have just 2 last questions for you, Amy, and then we're going to open it for questions from the audience, and we will try to answer as much as possible. So where is the treasure now? Because always people ask about the treasure, right? So the gold that you showed us, where is it now?
Okay, so I want to dispel, there's so much, mystery and anxiety. Maybe the treasure has been lost, maybe it's been divided up, or it has been confirmed it is back in secure location as it has been. It was displayed in 2003 and returned to the bank vaults of the central bank at Baghdad. So it's not available for study, it's not on exhibition, but it is preserved in a safe place, in a location that will eventually, it's keeping it in a stable condition, and it will eventually allow for its public display, so that hopefully we can all come to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and see it.
Yes, I would love to do so one day. Finally, we will get to see the treasure, hopefully sometime soon. Also, my last question, I know that you're working on a book on Assyrian queens, but I just want to know in general, what is your some of your future projects? What should we expect?
Well, I am working on this book on the queens the title, you know, it keeps changing. I don't know when it will be final, I guess when it's printed on the cover of the book, but right now I'm focusing on 3 kind of topics about the queens: the beauty, and that's an ideal beauty, the power, and the presence of these women. So I feel like that's all kind of combined 3 really important aspects of their identity, their beauty, power, and presence being really important. And then once I started thinking about presence, I started thinking beyond the presence of just the living queen, because we have the tombs there. You have the presence of their spirit forever. You have images of queens. And in ancient Mesopotamia, there is a concept of a presence living in an image. So that makes the experience of being in the palace all that more powerful, because it's filled not just with a living presence, but with an eternal presence in all of these ways that are not visible. It's a really charged environment. So I want to do another project after this book is done, just focusing on what is this presence and how can the identity of an individual live on eternally. And when we're looking back, you know, we're excavating, we're putting these things in museums. I don't think we should just look at them as empty pictures and statues, but that we should try to appreciate them from an Assyrian perspective, that is the eternal life of the subject that was represented. So that is a really exciting kind of next project that I hope to move on to.
That sounds fascinating, and I can't wait for the book to be published and we get the chance to read it, and maybe we can come back and discuss the book and see how your research had progressed, and we talk further about the queens. But also I would like to thank you to highlighting the eternal presence, because that adds another layer, and this is very selfish of me, to my visit and experience of Nimrud and the Northwest Palace. I personally walked through that complex, and that is an experience that I will never forget. And now with that I can think of the eternal presence of the queens, that they were buried there, that even makes that experience even more like amazing, or like I treasure that even more. So thank you for bringing really all these very important points and bringing them forward to the discussion. So we can talk, and we can talk more, and there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the queens of Nimrud. But I would like to stop here and give it back to Alexandra and to open it for the questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Amy.
You're so welcome. And I can't wait to hear from the audience now too.
Thank you both, Dr. Gansell and Dr. Malko, for the insight, for the ancient Assyrian queens, their garments, their jewelry, their political power, the role as a mother. I mean, that was really fascinating for me. And thank you both for having that entertaining presentation. We will now move forward with the Q&A portion of this webinar. So as a reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions, please make sure to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your page, and we will try our best to answer your questions. And with that said, let's get started with the questions. We have quite a few, so we'll get as much as we can. The first question is, what happened to the human remains from the excavations? And also, how might this research contribute or not to the study of the Assyrian continuity?
Okay, so the the remains of the women were taken to the Mosul Museum, and the bones were studied immediately after excavation. And a few small samples were taken to Germany to be tested for DNA, which would be really interesting in answering some of these questions, but they were unable to get any productive results. And the kinds of things that they were looking for also were relationships between the queens, and you know, to see if they're, you know, mother and daughter, or if there are relationships among them. And we just haven't been able to extract that kind of data. And I'm not sure if it is possible, if it will survive in the bones for possible future testing.
Definitely. And we have another question. Someone is interested in who are the specific queens. Were they from Assyrian elite families? Were they princesses of other kingdoms?
It seems like they were both. There's definitely significant evidence that they are coming from outside of Assyria, that they're coming from the Levant. We have that evidence primarily on the basis of their names, that they have non-Assyrian names. There's one case of a queen who looks like she may have had two names. She may have had a Levantine name and an Assyrian name. So we're not sure what circumstances, like her name was changed, or maybe she used one name in one context and another in another. We also have evidence for what looks like elite Assyrian women from Assyrian families having the opportunity to become queen. One in particular, this is a queen of Ashurnasirpal II, who founded the Northwest Palace. Her father was the cupbearer of the king. So a cupbearer is a very high ceremonial officer in the palace. And what we don't know is if the king and the cupbearer were friends and said, oh, well, you know, you can marry my daughter, or if the daughter was selected as queen, and as part of the package, the father was appointed as the cupbearer.
So we have another question, and this one is related to the kings. So since the queens were buried in the palaces and their ongoing presence were valued in the palace, what about the kings? Were they buried in the palace too? If not, what does this say about the religious significance of the queens?
That is a great question. And oh, I wish we had tombs that we could excavate that were intact belonging to the kings, but we don't. We do know where they were buried, though. They were buried beneath a palace, but a different palace in the city of Ashur. So it was another Assyrian capital. It was actually the oldest Assyrian capital, and it was a ceremonial and religious capital. So why the king's bodies were taken to Ashur and not buried in the palace where they were living and reigning raises a bit of a question. Their relationship to the empire and to the divine was slightly different than that of the queens. So it would have been a different ceremony, a different type of funeral that the kings would have had versus the queens. And the kings are living on their eternal life in this ancient capital. The queens are living on, I don't want to say in the domestic space, but in the space of the life of the empire, where the kings and queens were living and reigning. That is where they continued to exist. Now, at different cities, in different time periods, the Assyrians moved capitals. So that also raises the question of, might there be burials at these other capitals? And those have not yet been found, but it was only, relatively recently that the research on these queens has been conducted and that their burials were found. So it just presents a model for new research and new discoveries.
So someone is asking, who is your favorite queen that you studied so far and why? There's so many, but you have to pick, I think, one. I think they're asking for one or two.
I have to pick one. Well, okay. I will pick Hama. So Queen Hama, we have her burial, we have her bones, and we know her name from a seal that was buried with her that is inscribed naming her as Queen Hama. Now Hama is a Levantine name, so it's likely that she was a queen that had been brought in as maybe a member of a royal family from outside of the Assyrian Empire, or, kind of on the periphery as diplomatic. So we can think of these marriages as diplomatic. Hama died, though, when she was probably 18 to 20 years old. So she didn't have much opportunity to be queen. She's buried, if you might remember my slides, this huge gold headdress. She's buried with incredible wealth, with incredible honor. And it tells us that you didn't have to earn your identity as queen. You didn't, as soon as you were queen, you had it, you had that power, you had that beauty, this constructed beauty, you had that presence. And I think why she is one of my favorites is because she didn't get to live out her story. So I like to kind of think of what her experience would have been like coming at such a young age, thinking of what her future was, and then whatever happened that intervened and cut off her future didn't give her the chance to live that out. However, she's still in the Assyrian belief system in that palace, dwelling on today. So Hama is, I think, is a really special example of those queens.
Is there, so another person has a question about the significance to the locations of these tombs. How would the royal cult have operated with these tombs after the queen's deaths?
So the area of the palace where the tombs are is the residential quarters, where the king had a residential suite. I believe the queen had a throne room and residential suite, and there were other kind of living spaces. We don't even separate necessarily public and private, because different officials and individuals could be circulating in these spaces. They weren't necessarily cut off and completely this kind of private quarter. But the burials in these rooms, this is something we don't have the answer to, and I've thought a lot about. In one of the rooms, there's a pipe that goes down that would have stuck up out of the floor, that goes down to the top of the vault, that you would pour libations. You would pour probably wine in a ceremony to feed and present nourishment to a hungry and thirsty queen. There are also boxes where you could put, there's little kind of trap doors, you could go down steps, and there'd be an antechamber outside the main burial space where there are boxes where maybe you could put bread or other kinds of offerings. So they're definitely aware that the queens are buried in these spaces. They're interacting with the queens. What I don't know is what those rooms were used for, whether they were standard living spaces, and then there's a carpet, and underneath the carpet, every so often you would roll the carpet up and go visit the queen, or if they might have been set up in a more shrine-like and sacred manner.
Definitely. So someone is a couple people are interested about the preparation for the queen's burial. Were there any traces of mummification, or how were their bodies prepared?
So there are no traces of mummification. We know a little bit about the preparation for the funeral. There is a text that refers to washing the body, and it has members of the royal family and a royal daughter involved in the process of cleaning and probably purifying the royal body, because it is going into the afterlife. So it needs to be clean and as pure as possible. There's one body where there's evidence that the bones were heated, that the body was heated. So we don't know if that was a standard part of a preservation process to protect the body from decay, or if there was a circumstance which I have mused about, that either the queen died off-site and her body had to be preserved long enough to be brought back to the palace to have the funeral because she had to be buried in that palace, or if the queen did die in the palace, if the king, maybe he was off on military campaign, maybe he was at another one of the satellite capitals at the time, if he wasn't home and they had to wait for the king to get the message and return back to prepare for the state funeral. So that might present cases in which a body exceptionally would need to have some kind of treatment to be preserved before the funeral could take place.
So it's 9 o'clock. We'll do a couple more questions since we have quite a few people asking them. Another person is asking about the jewelry, the religious symbolism of the jewelry. Is there any religious functions to these jewelries that are of importance to the queen?
Absolutely. This jewelry was protective in an apotropaic way, I believe. So it would have repelled malevolence from the body of the queen. One of the things that we see, you might recall seeing some eye stones. They're like white circles that have a dark center in them. They were incorporated in a lot of the jewelry, in particular in places where the jewelry covered vital parts of the body, such as the skull, going down the spine, the wrists where you have very vital parts of your body, the chest. So they were kind of covered in eye stones physically, and I would also think mystically, symbolically protective manner to the queen. But there are also on some of those ice stones carved emblems of gods and goddesses. So it wasn't just the symbol, it was the presence of a deity that was being protected. There's also a few cases in which we have scenes of ritual that are depicted on the jewelry in very small scale. So nobody really would have been able to see it. If the queen looked at her own jewelry, she could have seen it, but it would be a reminder to the queen herself of her role, her presence in that political ritual system. And even when the queen isn't depicted, there's one that shows the crown prince and the king, and people say, oh, well, the queen wasn't part of the ritual, she's not depicted. The queen was wearing this. So she was a central part of the ritual that she's wearing on her wrist that's being depicted.
Okay, let's see. Someone is asking about what do you think makes the relative absence of ivory objects in the tombs?
So there were some ivory objects that were found in the tombs. Two things I think are going on. I think that, the textiles decayed. They were not preserved. The ivory and also wood might have decayed as well. So we might just not have the evidence for them surviving. If we did chemical tests on the soil, we might have been able to identify their presence, but they were excavated necessarily quickly for security reasons. When you find gold, you've got to get it out of the ground. So they didn't do a lot of very, time-consuming, lengthy testing on soil and things like that. Another possibility, though, is, ivory, part of these furnishings, that's what was in the palace. That's what was furnishing the living spaces of the palace. And if we think of those rooms above the tombs as belonging to the queens, they wouldn't have needed furniture sitting next to their coffin, because they could have gone up in the room above and used those furnishings, and the furnishings do not survive that were in the living spaces of the palace. What was found, I'll just add, for a lot of the yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, go on.
A lot of the furniture, when it was found, was in storage rooms. So it was kind of locked up. It's just like if you move out of your house, you're not going to leave everything sitting exactly where you left it. So it's really hard for us to reconstruct the use and placement of furniture in a living space.
Okay. So two more questions before we conclude. What do we know about the age of these queens at the time of their deaths?
So the age of the queens, from the testing that has been done on their bones, ranged from Hama, who was the youngest, probably as young as 18 when she died, to women in their 40s, possibly even up to 50, which would have been quite old at the time. We also do know, though, from texts, other queens lived to, maybe be in their 60s or even older, 70, 80 or something like that. So it was possible to live a very long life as a queen and be then kind of honored in the role sometimes of queen mother and even queen grandmother. And it seems like after the king died, some queens, if the queen outlived the king, she sometimes became the queen of the next king. And in cases that she didn't, she seems to have retained a palace of her own and still had authority within the empire until she saw her own death.
Well, I like the fact that a lot of Assyrian queens had power after the husband's deaths. That's actually, that's amazing. We have a question in the chat, and I think this will be the last that we'll have to answer to close up. Do you have any concerns about the potential destruction of the artifacts you've discovered?
The artifacts that have been discovered are nothing has left Iraq, so everything is kept in Iraq, and it is with the highest security that these objects have been sheltered and protected and monitored. And some things that may have suffered water damage or something like some destabilization of environment, we might say, from having been moved out of the ground and put in storage. That's not a museum storage at this time. There are conservation intervention and conservation training that has been given to Iraqi archaeologists and museum workers to help to address any kind of damage that they may see from having been in a destabilized environment. But from what I understand, they are monitored and that they are safe, and that we're looking forward to the day that we can all see them and turn some of those objects around that have only been photographed in the front and see what images they might have on the back, see what carvings of other gods and goddesses might be there, see what new pieces of history of these Assyrian queens we might learn from them.
Definitely. Okay, one more question, I promise, last one. Let's end it on a good note. Do ancient Assyrians believe in the afterlife?
Oh, absolutely. I would say, you know, even our concept of life and the afterlife is something different from what the Assyrians really believed in. They believed in existence. They believed in a presence that just continued, that shifted from this world that we are sharing and experiencing right now to an eternal world that went on forever. There was less of a concept, I think, of this break. There was a transition from one world to another, but their life, if you were a king or a queen, you were going to live on in the king and queen, as king and queen in the palace of the gods and goddesses. So your life was going to continue, and you were going to need to be prepared for that. But your identity as queen, your image, what you wore, that jewelry that you saw, that is going to be part of you forever.
Isn't that lovely? I like that. So thank you so much. We've now reached the end of this webinar, and I really want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who joined us today. I want to especially thank our two panelists, Dr. Gansell and Dr. Malko. Your contribution to the Assyrian community is vital and important, and on behalf of the Assyrian Studies Association, we are honored that you were able to join us here today for this amazing webinar. For our attendees, we encourage you to subscribe to our email list, and which can be found on our website, and to follow us on all social media platforms to stay informed about upcoming webinars, events, grant opportunities that we have for academics and authors, and for ways you can support our programs. We have an upcoming webinar next Saturday entitled Celebrity, Meaning, and Identity in Assyrian Pop Music, a look at Linda George. And this is with Nadia Yonan, who is a PhD candidate of ethnomusicology at the University of Toronto. To register, please visit our website. Again, thank you. We hope you enjoyed this amazing webinar, and we hope to see you back in the future. Be well and be safe. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Of course. Of course.